So, Neil Gaiman once famously observed that the reason we tell fairy tales is not to teach children that dragons exist, but rather to convince them that dragons can be defeated. Now, I'm a scientist, not a poet, but I think about science in exactly the same way. The world is facing tremendous problems today: climate change, social oppression, poverty, and war. Science is a tool that can certainly help us understand all of those problems. But I often think its true purpose is to teach us that we have the ability to fight back against them. You and I live in the first scientific age, where we're surrounded by remarkable technologies, where we have outstanding medical breakthroughs. And we've discovered that we're part of a much larger world that stretches from the unimaginably large down to the impossibly tiny. All of that knowledge mixes around and it points at a singular truth that says there are apparently no limits to what we're capable of understanding and doing. For all intents and purposes, there's no problem that you and I can't solve. So why do I think that? And more importantly, why do I think you ought to think that too? So let me tell you a story about myself. I had the great pleasure of knowing my great-grandmother, Dora Larson. And this view I have of the world, I think you can understand by thinking about how the world changed during her lifetime. Grandma Dora was born in 1895, and she passed away in 1993 when I was 24. When she was born, the world was illuminated by oil lamps, and people traveled around in horses and buggies. But by the time she passed away, people had walked on the moon, and the entire knowledge of our species was available to every one of us on a computer. The world lived through tumultuous times during her life: the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the first use of atomic weapons against humanity. But at the same time, in the background, we were making amazing discoveries about the way the universe was put together and about the way it works. Discoveries that change in a very profound way how we think about ourselves and our place in the universe. So to understand that, let me tell you 2 stories, one about the very small and one about the very large. When Grandma Dora was born, the periodic table was 24 years old. Chemists had figured out that everything in the world was made up of the things that appear on that table. Familiar things like carbon and oxygen, silicon, aluminum, but also unfamiliar things like barium and selenium and strontium. We had names for all of that stuff, but we really didn't know what any of it was. If I go outside and I pick up a rock and I cut it in half and into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, what is the final smallest piece that I end up with? Whatever it is, it's too small to see, and you might reasonably ask, why should I care? Well, the truth is, there's a great mystery hiding in those tiny, small pieces. Every one of you is a collection of things like calcium and carbon and iron and other stuff on the periodic table. But so is a frog, and so is a pine tree. And if I just take a pile of carbon and calcium and iron, I don't get a person or a frog or a pine tree. It's not the stuff that makes us up, it's how that stuff is put together. And it took physicists until the 1930s to discover that those tiniest little bits are what we call atoms, and it's the linking of them together that makes all the things in the world. The atoms themselves are made of even smaller building blocks called protons, neutrons, and electrons. But despite knowing that, that still doesn't tell us how you put it all together to get me or to get you. That discovery was initiated by taking a single photograph in 1952. This is called Photo 51. It was taken by a scientist named Rosalind Franklin and her graduate student, Raymond Gosling. This is the very first picture ever taken of DNA, the master molecule that describes all life on planet Earth. The discovery of DNA showed us a singular truth, that all life on this planet is inextricably linked. My DNA is exactly the same as your DNA, which is exactly the same as the DNA of a frog and a pine tree. The story of life on this planet is written in DNA molecules. Novels written using the same words over and over again, but in different order for different life forms. That's what makes me, me, and that's what makes you, you. So, this is an example of how we can use something, curiosity and technology, to discover something about the way the world works. This is impossibly small, but we still had the wherewithal to come together and figure out how it's all put together. Let me tell you a story about something very big. So today, I live in the city of Chicago, and this is the view we have of the city from our vantage point at the Adler Planetarium on the shores of Lake Michigan. Now, it may surprise you to know that this picture was taken at night. We live in an age where we can banish the darkness from our cities. But if there's ever a power outage, then the view that will emerge is one that's not unfamiliar to those of us who grew up in places like Montana. The Milky River of the Milky Way arching overhead from one side of the sky to the other. This is what the sky looked like when my grandma Dora was growing up. And in a very real way, it defined the way we thought about the universe. Astronomers thought the Milky Way was the entire universe and that the sun lived somewhere near its center. That's a very limited view of the cosmos, and the reason we had that limited view was because measuring distances is very difficult in astronomy. There's nothing in this picture that's close enough that any human, then or now, will ever visit any of those faraway stars. The problem of distance was solved by an astronomer at Harvard named Henrietta Swan-Leavitt. She discovered that there are certain stars that if you look at them in a telescope and you can measure their brightness, then you can tell how far away they are. Today, we call that Leavitt's law, and it's one of the most important discoveries that we ever made in astronomy. It was used almost immediately to show that the sun didn't live at the center of the Milky Way. It actually lives somewhere in the rowdy outskirts in a place called the Orion Cygnus spiral arm. We used it to measure the distance to another galaxy for the first time, showing that it was millions of light years past the boundaries of the Milky Way, and that the universe was larger by far than any astronomer had thought was reasonable up to that time. And in 1929, Leavitt's law played a role in showing us that the universe was expanding. Today, we look at that expansion, and we know we're looking at the evolving cosmos. We know that we're seeing the universe having grown from 14 billion years from a primeval fireball that we call the Big Bang. All of this just serves to point to the idea that the universe is really vast on scales that's very difficult for us to imagine and comprehend. Despite the fact that the universe is older than our galaxy or the sun or the earth or me and you, we've been able to piece together the story of its life and where we came from, using a tool called a telescope and a law discovered by a Harvard astronomer. That's one example, another example of this profound ability we have to take impossible problems and work them out and figure out how things work together. All of this and more happened over the course of just 100 years. If you lived as long as my great-grandmother lived, then you saw tumultuous times, not unlike the ones we're living through today. And you may have wondered, is the world ever going to emerge on the far side? The poet Delmore Schwartz once said, "Time is the fire in which we burn." And he's absolutely right. We're victims of our own history, but only if we look backwards with limited eyes. We are capable of doing amazing and impressive things to improve our lives. And we know that because we've made remarkable discoveries that we have no business knowing the answers to about how the universe works. So, in the end, science is a tool that we can use to improve our lives. But it's also a way to expand our consciousness. It gives us perspectives in exactly the same ways as art and literature and poetry. These are the things that define at their core what it means to be human. And these are the things that we turn to when we need the courage in our abilities to conquer all the struggles that we face every day.